Hello and welcome back to the DoneDeal YouTube channel, and today you join us in County Sligo and we are with Volkswagen's new ID.5. Now at a first glance you might be thinking that looks pretty similar to an ID.4, and that's because for the most part it is, except it's a little bit different around the rear. Now in this review we're going to be taking it for a drive and discussing what that's like, talking about all the driving aids and most importantly the different battery, the range, charge times. These are all things that you really have to look into when buying an EV. Now if you would like to know a little bit more about buying an electric car, then hit the link up there and that gives you all the information you might need. Prices for the ID.5 start at a little bit over 61,000 euros, which unfortunately means in Ireland you're not able to avail of the grant, the 5,000 euro SCAI grant. That said, it still sits pretty well, and of course you can spec it all the way up into the 70s and even more. Another thing to note is this one is actually for sale in Connolly's Volkswagen Sligo for about 57,000 euros. That's because it's a demonstration model, first edition. But anyway, let's get into the review. In terms of styling, the front, it's the exact same as the ID.4. One thing I do really like on the ID.4 and now the ID.5 is this light bar that goes along. If I unlock it, this lights up and it looks brilliant. From the side profile, the driver's door forward is identical to the ID.4, but now from the driver's door back is where you begin to see the changes. You've got a sloping rear roofline, which I think looks quite well. Now we will take a seat in the back and see if that affects it in a short moment, but first let's check out the rear. Now this angle is probably the most noticeably different one, mainly because it says ID.5 instead of ID.4, but also instead of kind of having a hatchback straight down window, it's got this sloping rear window into this massive spoiler. Let me know in the comments which you prefer, the ID.4 or the ID.5. Personally, I actually prefer the ID.5, but that's because I'm younger and I don't really need a lot of storage. And that brings me into the next part, which is the boot. Now this one doesn't have an electric tailgate, and we'll be talking about the different versions in a short while, but despite the kind of sloping rear roofline, it still has 550 litres in here, which is over 120 or 130 litres more than a Volkswagen Golf, so it's absolutely massive. As you can see, we've got a massive drone case in here, slides in, virtually no load lip, plenty of tie down points. You can also fold down those seats, and there's a bit of storage under there for your chargers. Now one thing a lot of electric cars have is a front boot or a fruit. One thing I love about EVs is you can put in your takeaway on a Sunday night underneath the bonnet in the front boot and it doesn't stink out the car. Unfortunately, in the ID.5 and the ID.4 there is no front boot. What there is a 12 volt battery, a fuse box, and I suppose the only time you'll ever really be going in here is to top up your windscreen washer fluid, which is a good thing to know, but other than that it's very much like an ordinary engine bay in there. Now in the rear, this is where things should get quite interesting, but to be fair it's actually pretty spacious. So to begin with, knee space, tons and tons of room here. It actually reminds me of an old Skoda Superb in terms of legroom, and you can actually tuck your feet under the seat in front of you. And even headspace, panoramic sunroof, plenty for someone like me. Maybe if you're over 6 foot you'll suffer a little bit, but you've got enough advantages in life, so tough one for you. Armrest here with 2 drink holders, which is nice and handy. And as a whole, it is very, very comfortable back here. ISOFIX points really easily accessible. And actually one thing to note is there's also an ISOFIX point here in the front. Not too many cars nowadays have 3 ISOFIX points, meaning that you can have 3 baby seats. Really, really like that. And yeah, as a whole, it's a lovely place to sit, but not quite as good as the front. So let's go check that out. So in the front, well, it is a lovely place to sit. I really like this in the ID cars, being able to just have a kind of very adjustable armrest. If you want your arm quite high, you can do that. Just really nice. And again here on this side, comfortable position to be in, particularly on a long drive. Now one of my favorite things about this car is to turn it on, you don't actually have to press the button here. You just put it off into gear and off you go. Now we're not actually going to drive anywhere right now, but if we were to show the infotainment system, this is a really large screen. When it came out, it was a little bit glitchy. now, after spending a bit of time in it, I've driven a few ID.3s, ID.4s, ID.5s. It is actually pretty good. Your Apple CarPlay connects up wirelessly and it works seamlessly. You don't actually tend to use the system itself, but there's so much adjustability in it. You can change the colors here, you can do whatever you like. Still a little bit annoying that there's no volume knob here. You kind of have to run your finger up and down there, and the climate control at night is a little bit fiddly, but it's well known. You do have a small little display here. There's not much customization with it, but it shows you your range, your battery percentage, and a few things like that. And then this one actually has a heads-up display. Difficult to show on camera, but that is brilliant on a long drive. It just means your eye line can stay forward and you don't have to look down here to see your speed or anything like that. And that's basically it. There's great storage in here for 2 drinks. There's wireless charging down here, USB-C charging points. There's actually 2 in the rear as well. More cup holders that are completely customizable. A decent sized glove box. So as a whole, it's a lovely place to sit. It's very comfortable, and because it's an electric car, it comes with a lot of bells and whistles. Things like heated seats, which you just, once you begin using heated seats, particularly on a wet day like today, you just can't beat them. One last thing I want to show you. Not sure if this is clever or a little bit frustrating, but I actually think it's kind of cool. So to put down the windows, it's there. But you don't have any way to do the rear windows. However, if you tap this, it then does the rear windows. Those small little details, I quite like them. I suspect it's cost cutting, but it's just a bit different and a bit interesting. Anyway, let's go drive. It's very smooth. If you've never driven an electric car before, it is a little bit different, mainly because you don't really go near the brake too much. I'll talk a bit more about that now in a second. But also because it's fully automatic. So if you're coming from a manual, it's going to feel different. Make sure to only use your right foot. You don't start using your left foot for braking. But once you get up on the road, it is quite quiet as you drive along. And it feels like a Volkswagen. It just feels very solid. Now, a couple things to point out. The first is, this is rear wheel drive. Now, if you ever had a Golf or a Tiguan or anything like that, chances are it was front wheel drive. Driven from the rear, if you're a true petrol head, it's more enjoyable. But in something like this, you nearly don't notice it. What I will say is though, on a wet or slippy day, just be careful putting your foot on the accelerator too hard, because these do have a lot of torque. And as we said, they're 174 to 300 brake horsepower, depending which version you get. When you put your foot down, it picks up nice and quickly. Depending on which version you get, you'll get different features in terms of autonomous driving. So this one's got adaptive cruise control. So I set it to now 100 kilometers per hour. And then when the car in front of me begins to slow down, the ID.5 will slow down too. And when it speeds up, it'll speed back up. And actually it has both here and on my display up on my windscreen, it's got my speed. So I know what my speed is, but also what the speed limit is, which saves you going, oh, what's the speed limit on this road? Which, let's be honest, does happen us all. Other features, well, if you get the upgraded 3
Voice control has been cancelled because it has been paused for a long time.
Must have been paused for a very long time. But what I was going to say is, if you get the updated 3.1 software, which will come over the air, so if you don't have it yet, it will update just like your iPhone or your Android updates overnight. But it's brilliant. There's a few changes, one of which is if you've got lane assist and you go to change lane, you don't have to cancel it to overtake on a dual carriageway or motorway. You just put your indicator on and off you go. It's actually really cool. But the other thing that it does is it operates a little bit more efficiently. And that's really interesting. This long-term range, bearing in mind this is test drive car, it's probably had people putting their foot down to feel the acceleration. It's averaging 18.7 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, which is pretty decent in this. Means you could probably get around 15 if you were driving fairly careful, if not lower. So yeah, as a whole, pretty efficient, comfortable to drive. It's got some nice features. Now let's talk about range. So, range, well, it obviously depends which version you get. The reason being is the GTX, with having 2 electric motors, is less efficient than one that's just rear wheel drive, but also the power output, the size of the wheels, there's a few external factors. Now what I will say is real world range in most ID.5s and 4s is probably around the 420, 430 kilometers, which in my opinion is more than enough. It would be enough to go from Dublin to Sligo and back to Dublin again, which is the drive I'm doing today. But it's not, that's fine, I'll just leave it at the but. Obviously a few things that will affect this is how much you use the air conditioning, your driving style, and then the type of roads. If you're on the motorway going 120 kilometers per hour, it's not as efficient as it is on a back road where it's able to use the regenerative braking, which brings me nicely on to regenerative braking. So up here there's two modes, there's D and B is for regenerative braking. And what that means is when I come up to a set of lights, I take my foot off the accelerator and it begins to slowly ease on the brakes, but it's not actually the brakes, it's using the electric motor to recoup power, to regenerate energy, and then increase my range. It's weird when you first drive it because you take your foot off the accelerator and you go like this, but once you get used to it, you'll never ever go back. It's just brilliant. I'm actually going to use it now as I pull off here, and you'll see. So right now, I'm not going near the brake and I'm slowing right the way down. And eventually you'll come almost to a halt. There's not quite one pedal driving in this, but it does slow right down. In terms of variants, there is loads to choose from, almost too many, and my advice would actually be to maybe go down to your local dealer, Connolly's if you're up in Sligo, or wherever it might be in the rest of Ireland, and if you want to find out where that is, you can click up there. But very quickly, the entry version is the business, then there's the family, there's the tech, there's the max, there's the GTX, there's the GTX Max, there's all sorts of different versions. Now, which would be my pick? Probably either the entry business or else the Max. The main reason I say the Max is you get the heat pump, you get sportier seats, you get the driver assistance plus package, which is lane assist, adaptive cruise control, and it's just probably a little bit better of a package. However, they actually come very well spec'd as standard. Now in terms of power, well, there is kind of only really one option. Well, no, that's a lie. Then in terms of power, there's also a few different options. To begin with, you can get an either. Then in terms of power, there's also a few options. To begin with, there's a 170 brake horsepower version and then a 204 brake horsepower version. That's probably the one to go for. And that's operated through a 150 kilowatt motor, which goes to the rear wheels. But then on top of that, there's also the GTX version, which is all-wheel drive, gets a second electric motor to the front wheels and is about 300 brake horsepower. We actually have reviewed that in ID.4 form. I personally probably wouldn't bother going all the way up to that extra power. It's a little bit unnecessary and it costs a lot more. But yeah, there's tons of options. Another thing worth noting is in terms of charge times, well, they all come with 135 kilowatt charging, which means you can, like a lot of electric cars, in about a half an hour get an 80% charge at a fast charger. In Ireland, you're kind of restricted to Ionity with that, which is quite expensive. So really it's about having a home charger and planning your journeys appropriately. So there you have it. That is Volkswagen's ID.5. Personally, I'm a big fan of the look with the spoiler, but I'll leave that one up to you. And I definitely would say it's up to you. That said, an ID.4 and entry level one, because of the grant, is about 6,000 or 7,000 euro cheaper, which in my opinion is probably worth going for. It's definitely a tough one, and my advice would always be go to your local dealer. They might have some demos, they'll be able to spec one for you. It's just the best way to get a grasp, particularly when it comes to driving an electric car if you're moving from maybe a traditional combustion engine. Anyway, hopefully you've learned something from this video. If you have, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and of course subscribe. Big thanks to Connolly's Sligo Volkswagen for having us up to check out the new ID.5. Really look forward to doing a bit more driving as we drop it back, and we'll see you in the next one.